Hello, hello. Happy Monday. Welcome to the live stream. Just me, Jess, today. Unfortunately, no special guests joining me, but hopefully I will be entertaining enough and we'll have a bunch of questions to answer and a bunch of conversations to have. So I will do my best, even though I'm on my own. I know everybody seems to really like the other candidate conversations that we've been doing. So hopefully we can keep doing those as time goes on. But today you just got me. All right, so what do I want to start with? I think I wanted to start with what I've been up to and what's going on with the campaign. So let's start with kind of end of last week. At the end of last week, if you are signed up for my emails, you already know this, but if you're not, this will be news to you. I stepped away from my job on Friday. So today was my first day as a full-time candidate for office, full-time campaigner. And that's a hard choice to make, but I recognize that when I looked at it, the work that we're doing with this campaign is just way too important to be doing it part-time. And we have thousands of working people who have donated their hard-earned money to this campaign to power it. There are hundreds of volunteers who are dedicating hours of their lives to performing voter contact for us. So I couldn't just sit back and not do this full time too, right? Like I need to dedicate every hour that I can to this work as well. And the reason for that, and the reason that we have such strong volunteers and such passionate volunteers is because this is winnable. This is a winnable race. And I know that from the many conversations that I have continually had with Delawareans. We are running to fight for the things that people are looking for, and we're saying, join us and let's fight for them together. And that is making all the difference for people. So I am officially full-time. This is my first full-time day as a candidate. So if you didn't know that by email, it would be a great idea to sign up for our emails, which you can do at justfordelaware.com. So also on Friday, I attended a protest and a rally in the city of Wilmington, and this one was specifically about sentencing disparities and how Black, typically men, but women as well. This is specifically talking about some men who were sentenced to disproportionately long sentences for the crimes that they were convicted of. And at this protest, we were able to hear from mothers and wives and family members of people who are serving that sentence too. A woman spoke about her son who has been put away for 25 years at the age of 28 for drugs that he had in his pocket. And, people end up calling sentences that long, natural life sentences, because while, yes, he may get out, he will have spent the majority of his life in prison at the end of a sentence like that. And it's typically for these non-violent drug crimes that you see these disparities. Crimes that white men and white people will get much smaller sentences if they get a sentence at all. And then Black men are being put in jail for decades at a time. So I was happy to join that protest and stand in solidarity with those families and I hope to continue to support them in their fight. And then yesterday there was another event, and this one took place at the Sussex Correctional Institution down in Sussex County. And this event was put together by organizers who have friends and family in that institution. And one of the big reasons is because a third of the inmates in that prison have now tested positive for COVID-19. And this is after Department of Corrections told us they had this under control. They told us they didn't need to release anyone. Since March, our campaign has been calling for nonviolent offenders, elderly offenders, people who are close to the end of their sentence, people who are being held prior to even being charged. We've called for those people to be released because we know that prisons are apt to be hotspots for coronavirus. And, the Commissioner of Department of Corrections, Commissioner DeMattis, you know, was interviewed about this and everyone's concerns, and her statement was dismissive about the concerns of inmates and their families, and she said that, you know, the prisoners are always going to find something to complain about. And I don't think death by COVID-19, when you certainly were not sentenced to that, is just a complaint. So this was an opportunity to stand in solidarity with the people who are fighting for their loved ones, who are imprisoned and being subjected to this outbreak, and against the actions that are being taken by Department of Corrections. You know, we have heard that people are being moved, people who are knowingly infected are being moved to units where there are non-infected people and then causing additional spread. We have heard about brutality against inmates who are sick. So that was what we were there for, to stand and say this is not acceptable. You know, just because people are incarcerated does not mean that we don't also need to guarantee their health and their safety. You know, this is everything we fight for is typically for all, right? We talk about things for all for a reason, and that includes people who are currently incarcerated. Like, any of these deaths that may come of this and have come of this were entirely preventable, but instead the people in charge chose to do nothing, and we are seeing the results of that now, and we have to continue calling on them to change and take actual action to protect incarcerated people. So yes, I'll continue to share any of these events. I try to always put them up on Instagram before I'm attending them. That's usually the best place to find them, over on Instagram.com/JessForDelaware. So usually when I'm attending things, or even if I'm not able to attend, I still try to share them just so people know what's going on if they want to participate. So some other updates just about the campaign. You know, we've kind of talked about merch coming, but as of today, I have t-shirts. So some of them look like this. And, you know, some others look like, hold on, please hold. Look like this. Sick. So these are super dope. Just to give them a shout out, each one was individually screen printed over at Other Industries, which is a local t-shirt shop and print shop. They did an awesome job. So if you're looking for anything to be screen printed, definitely check them out. Go give them some work. So I'm going to have these up on our website shortly, and you'll be able to purchase them there and kind of rep the brand throughout the state and everywhere else. So keep an eye out for that. Then this weekend I was working on, we'll just call it a very exciting campaign project, kind of up and down the state, working with some creative types, we'll say, to put something together. So that should be another thing that we're ready to unveil in a couple weeks. So keep your eyes peeled. And other thing that happened last week, if you missed it, we were endorsed by Working Families Party. So I'm incredibly proud of that. And you know, we joined a slate of fantastic candidates throughout our state. You know, we're talking about Shanae Darby, who you had an opportunity to meet on a live stream a few weeks ago, and Kobe Owens, who are both running for Wilmington City Council. Larry Lambert, Eric Morrison, Marie Pinkney, who we talked to last week, and Medina Wilson-Anton, who we also talked to a few weeks ago, all running for General Assembly. So this is a fantastic group of candidates. I'm really proud to be a part of it, and I'm really proud of the work that WFP is doing in Delaware, because they are committed to building multiracial, working-class power in our state and ensuring that people who are fighting for those things get elected to our government up and down the ticket. So we are really proud of that. I want to comment before we get to questions, which I know they're starting to come in. So I want to comment a little bit about more of like a national thing, because I don't think it's irrelevant to us in Delaware, and that's really what's been going on in Portland. So if you haven't seen what's going on there, just a little bit of background. There have been ongoing protests in Portland for Black Lives Matter and calls to change policing and public safety. And what has started to happen is that federal agents were deployed by the Trump administration to essentially police those streets. But what has been happening is that those agents have been unidentified. There's essentially militarized troops showing up in Portland, not identifying themselves, unclear often what branch of the military or law enforcement they are even from. They have been renting literally unmarked cars and then kidnapping protesters and taking them off the streets. There's very clear violations of people's rights going on here, and these forces are acting with impunity outside of the jurisdiction of any of the other law enforcement agencies in the city of Portland. This is not acceptable. It's quite horrifying, and it looks a lot like those same kind of sketchy forces that showed up in Washington, D.C., I think last month, cleared out a square kind of violently and aggressively. And what we know now is that the people who are being deployed to Portland are troops essentially within the Department of Homeland Security. So the Trump administration is deploying Homeland Security agents against people protesting, Americans protesting in Portland. And again, you can say well, it's happening in Portland, it's not happening here. But what we're now hearing is that they're planning to extend this to multiple cities across the country. I think Chicago is the one that's being talked about most right now. And this is not something that we can simply ignore. I mean, this is setting a level of precedent for what the federal government is going to start to believe is acceptable in terms of crushing protest and dissent, crushing First Amendment rights. We can't have the people in power raising their hands and saying, someone please do something about this. Oh, this is so concerning. This is not a time for concern. This is a time for actual action. There are a variety of committees who have jurisdiction and oversight of Homeland Security. In fact, the Senate Judiciary Committee, which Senator Coons sits on, specifically does, as well as multiple subcommittees that exist within that same structure. We need those committees to be meeting and taking actual action. I mean, we know that the Department of Homeland Security already has a sketchy history with surveilling Americans and people in our country, from activists, journalists, even lawyers, and this has been going on for years and years. And now we're seeing them escalate and begin picking people up off the streets, taking them to unclear locations, separating them from their phones and their friends and family, seemingly, not respecting their rights. And we have actual leaders in our government who are not using their power to stop this. And that is something that you should absolutely be demanding right now, is that our leaders in power use their oversight power to put an end to this, because this is not something we need to see extended to multiple cities. This is not something that we can accept. And I think it's really questionable when you see sometimes, I think there's this element of people who disagree with the protests, who are cheering this on. And I think whenever you see something like that, you really have to question it, because at any moment, the focus of a force like this can change. And once you start allowing some people to lose their rights, it's a slippery slope to allowing other people to lose their rights, or some people to lose different types of rights. So this is unacceptable. We need to put a stop to it right now. This cannot accelerate from here. And I don't know, I'm just still thinking about this, because I think this is part of where the conversation about abolishing ICE comes from. This is what ICE has been doing in immigrant communities and to immigrant families for years. Showing up, unclear about who they are sometimes, and in fact, impersonating people sometimes, or impersonating different professions, picking people up, tearing them away from their families, and then sending them often to countries that they don't even know as home. And that is why people have been calling for the abolishment of ICE, because when you allow it to happen to one group, it always seems to escalate to start happening to another group. And that's why we have to always stand together and stand up for each other and ignore the social or physical differences between ourselves and stand against actions like this. All right, so all right, so some questions. I'll start answering questions. All right, first is good question here from Jeanette. So, how do you plan to address laws and state agencies that provide services for the intellectually disabled? Resources seem to be limited, and case managers do not provide adequate servicing to consumers and families. They're using COVID for delays in services, but services have already been limited and almost discourage families from seeking help. This is a great question, and it is something I've heard from other people as well, Jeanette. So if this is what your family's experiencing, I know it's maybe not give any solace, but I know that there are other people who are going through this as well. We have a disability rights portion of our platform predominantly from the conversations that I've had with disability advocates and activists. And the core of that, much like the core of the platform as a whole, is that we absolutely need to be guaranteeing protection and a dignified standard of life for all people, including people that are living with disabilities and their caretakers. That's why things like universal health care is incredibly important, and that's why paying people for the care that they deliver, because often that is unpaid work that goes ignored. Ensuring that there are protections against workplace discrimination. I think something that a lot of disability activists that I've talked to in the past 3 months have been incredibly frustrated with is the fact that there were so few accommodations that workplaces were willing to make for people living with disabilities. And then suddenly, once coronavirus hits, working from home is acceptable. Schools can figure out how to deliver programming digitally. You don't have to be in the classroom to receive that programming. And these were barriers that prevented people living with disabilities from attending lectures or school and keeping full-time jobs. If you're someone who has a disability that results in chronic pain, for example, you can't always get up and out of bed and get to a workplace. But you could maybe do work in smaller chunks from home. But that was never an accommodation that was made. So I know that there's a lot of frustration noticing how quickly companies were able to transition when they needed to. So preventing those types of discrimination are incredibly important. The other piece is actually, to the point that Jeanette makes, is truly fully funding these programs. So that is one of the biggest problems we see, is that we rarely allocate the funds that are actually necessary to deliver the care and level of programming that people need. And then people get frustrated and they say that these programs don't work and they don't seem valuable, and that's how they end up getting further cut, actually, instead of investing in them so that they can deliver what people need. And another piece of that is actual enforcement of ADA laws. There's a lot of exceptions that get made to ADA that impair particularly people with mobility-related disabilities, I think, from actually being able to work or attend school or live their lives. And that enforcement has been ignored for far too long. So things that I'm committed to fighting for are expanding Social Security disability insurance, and supplemental social income, and ensuring that that's an actual living wage. Because the majority of people who rely on those wages are not able to keep a roof over their heads, feed themselves, pay their bills. They're forced into poverty because of how low those payments are. So the Social Security as a whole, the entire program needs to be expanded, and those payments need to be livable wages that people can survive on and thrive on. There are some wage exceptions that exist and laws that allow wages to be different for people who are living with disabilities. We have to end any exception like that and ensure that no one is being, wages aren't being abused for people living with disabilities. And the other piece that I talk about a lot is, kind of mentioned at the beginning, is like long-term support and services that actually funding those programs. So those are both like either living in your community or facility-based programs, including that in Medicare for All legislation, so that these programs are fully funded, because they are often people who don't have the money to pay for them are excluded from them, and it's a barrier right now for people who need those services. So Lisa asks, are you accepting corporate money and willing to pledge not to? Well, already have. Yeah, so I have already pledged to not take any corporate PAC money. All of my donations have been from individuals. Unlike my opponent, who the vast majority of their money is coming from PACs, including fossil fuel companies, predominantly pharmaceutical companies, defense contractors, insurance companies, developers, real estate developers, and student loan companies. So yeah, I have pledged to not accept any corporate money. I took the No Fossil Fuel pledge as well, that is put out by the Sunrise Movement. And one of the things I want to fight for is moving toward publicly financed elections and moving away from money in politics. I think so much of what we are dealing with and we are fighting against is due to money in politics and its influence, and we need to completely eradicate it to move forward in the direction that we need to. So Sam asks, you mentioned advocating for legalization of prostitution. Would you like to hear? I would like to hear more about the actions that you've taken. So this comes from, again, like conversations with sex workers, and criminalizing sex work makes them less safe. And particularly what I support is actually decriminalization, which is a bit different than legalization. Legalization is making, essentially a state acceptable market. Decriminalization is making it so that you won't go to prison for being a sex worker. And I support repealing SESTA-FOSTA laws, because those were policies that were predominantly carceral, focused on jail time and punishment, that continue to build up our prison industrial complex. They are enforced in a racist and classist way. And again, they're not making people safer. Those were laws that came out of wanting to end human trafficking, but they weren't written with input from the communities that they most affect. And it's actually made sex workers less safe because of the limitations that were put in place by those laws. I don't know that there are a ton of people in Delaware doing work around this right now. If anyone does know and wants to share any organizations who are supporting sex workers or working to ensure their safety, like, please definitely reach out, because I know that there's some groups, particularly in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, that I'm aware of, but not as many here in the state of Delaware. So I'd love to definitely talk to more people about this issue. All right, so let's see. So Teresa says, DeMattis doesn't care about prisoners at all. what we do about sentencing over bail, over charges. Thanks for marching with us and hearing us. Much appreciated. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely welcome for marching. I always appreciate it when people share with me actions that are taking place too, so that, I have the ability to know what's going on, share it with my followers, and show up if I can. And I've been trying to show up to a lot of these events because I think it's incredibly important, and I think it's good to support the organizing work that is going into them and the causes that they're backing. So some of the things from a criminal justice perspective that I think we need to be fighting for are, first of all, abolishing cash bail. Cash bail is inherently regressive. It's much harder for poor people to post bail than it is for wealthier people, which means for the exact same crime, someone is sitting in jail and someone else is able to walk free because they were able to post that bail. That is a unjust system, and that needs to be ended. Another thing is we need to look at decriminalizing nonviolent offenses. What we're talking about there is things that really end up criminalizing poverty. So we need to find a way to actually help people who are experiencing poverty, institute programs that get rid of things like housing instability, ensure that when they have a job, they actually make wages that they can survive on, and that fight for the things that actually get to the root causes of crime rather than criminalizing all of these common and nonviolent behaviors. So that's where I get into decriminalizing drug use. Drug use should not be a carceral issue, it should be a public health issue. If someone is using drugs and they want help, we should be offering them help, not jail. I actually spoke to a woman at that event in Sussex yesterday whose family member was in jail because of relapsing, and she made a point of saying he's not getting the help that he needs from that prison system, and it's instead locking him up, taking away years of his life. His daughter's growing up without him in her life when we could be helping him. We could be helping him deal with this addiction rather than punishing him for having an addiction. This gets back to the question that just came up a little bit before about sex work. There are people who volunteer on our team who are sex workers, and that is something, again, that should be decriminalized. This is not an action that people should be incarcerated for, particularly when we're talking about actions taken by adults. We have so many things that we rely on a punitive justice system for, rather than a more restorative justice system, rather than looking at what's actually causing the crime that people are committing and solving those problems, and not just treating the symptom of it. I absolutely think we need to abolish private prisons and stop building more prisons. We spend more to incarcerate a person than we do to educate a person, and that's where we get to what we're talking about right now in response to the murder of George Floyd and all of these uprisings. When people say defunding the police, they're talking about refunding all of the other social services that we actually need. So instead of continuing to invest in particularly private prisons at all, why don't we invest in housing? Why don't we invest in our schools? Why don't we invest in public health? These are all the things that actually make people safer, and those are the things that I think we should be focused on. I also support ending mandatory minimum sentences. I think those are another thing that we have instituted that has done more harm than good, and completely ignores the circumstances of someone's crime, and treats, and particularly because they are often enforced on drug offenses, and we're putting people away for drug crimes rather than getting them the help that they need. So Marianne asks, how do you propose to maintain the viability of Social Security? And this is a great question, because there are a lot of people out there who will tell you that Social Security is not viable, but they are not telling you the truth. And they are often people who are deficit hawks, who see a budget deficit, a federal government budget deficit, and simply want to get rid of it. And they fail to think, like, what did that deficit actually create? Because every dollar that the government spends into the economy and doesn't tax back is technically a deficit. But that doesn't mean it's negative, because that dollar is now circulating in the economy. So Social Security is actually funded for many decades. I think it's like 80% funded 50 years into the future. There is just this fear-mongering that happens because there are people in our government who want to take away and cut social programs. And what they have done is use that as an excuse. So Social Security is viable as long as Congress writes the bill and agrees to fund it. But we can expand it by doing what's called, people have been calling scrapping the cap. So there's a cap on the contributions that people make to Social Security. Once you hit $130,000 of income in a year, you no longer contribute to Social Security. So your next check, it almost looks like you got a raise in it because that tax is no longer being taken out. That's completely unnecessary. We're talking about the highest earners in our country essentially getting a tax break. So if we scrap that cap and we continue to tax them and fund Social Security with those dollars, then this question of viability is even less of an issue, because now we can actually expand the program, increase those payments to a living wage that, like I was talking about earlier, and the pool even increases. And there's really no reason to be giving the wealthiest people in our country a tax cut when it comes to funding Social Security. All right, so Marianne asks another question. Suppose you win a Senate seat, but the Democrats fail to flip the Senate. Let's hope that doesn't happen, but in this hypothetical, what would your strategies be to work with Republicans to move your agenda forward? So in this situation, what I've talked about a lot is that the issue is not necessarily working with Republicans. It's working with Republicans at the expense of the most vulnerable people. And that's what I think I see too much of and I get really frustrated by. So what I would be looking at is, where can we work in places where it doesn't require me to compromise the values, my stated values that I've run on and live? And where does it not compromise the people in our country who need the most help? Working people of our country who actually need a government that supports them. So if there are bills that the GOP senators are willing to support that actually improve the conditions of lives of working people in our country, then I will absolutely work with them on that. I think there was something going around, just like a Twitter exchange between Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ted Cruz last year, and it was a bill basically to say that, I think it was that lobbyists, like to end the kind of revolving door of like Congress people becoming lobbyists becoming Congress people. And they were like kind of going back and forth and saying like, yeah, if you want to do this, I will work with you on this because this is better for the country and better for people. That's the type of thing that we should be compromising on. And we shouldn't be going into every debate saying, where do we think the GOP will agree? And let's start there. Because we know that they're not going to agree to those terms, and they're going to pull us further and further to the right, and we're going to end up with right or center right at best policy, rather than starting from a place that says, what do we actually want to stand for and fight for? Not what's our end game, and let's start at our end game. But I mean, there's always an argument that there's not going to be anywhere that GOP senators are going to be willing to work with me to actually deliver a government that works for all people. They haven't necessarily shown themselves to be that interested in that. So what that means instead is we have to replace them. And you won't catch me dead calling Mitch McConnell my friend, as my opponent has. Mitch McConnell has been a friend to no one but himself. People in Kentucky don't like Mitch McConnell. And he has done nothing but prevent good legislation from coming to the floor of the Senate. So what we need to be doing is fighting to build power, democratic power, in our state and the country as a whole. And one of the ways that our campaign has frankly already done that is by registering countless new voters. We have brought independents and Republicans and non-voters into the Democratic Party. And the reason that we've been able to do that is because I am running on things that people want. And I'm not doing that simply to tell them what they want, which is a weird criticism that my opponent's team has put out against me. Oh, it's easy to run when you tell people what they want to hear. Why would you stand against the things that people want? That's what we should be fighting for. You are their representative. So when you fight for the things that people, when you recognize, frankly, the problems that people are facing and you speak directly to them, people want to join the fight. When you listen to them about the solutions that they see and the things that would make their lives better, people want to join the fight. So that's what we need to be doing. We need to be running on policy that engages people and that they want to fight for. And we need to be running people who are willing to do the work of activists and advocates and actually bringing in the voices of the organizers and the activists at home who are doing that work on the ground and boosting them. Because nothing ever comes from the top down. It always boils out from the people up. And we need people elected into these seats that recognize that and that use that energy to push it over the finish line. And that's the commitment that I'm making as a senator. So Paula says, all our current politicians are allowing these situations to happen and exist. I don't see a change just by voting in November when nothing has happened to date. And Paula, I imagine that there are a lot of people who are nodding their heads right now because that is a sentiment that we hear a lot. That people just don't understand why they should vote when nothing has changed in the past. And I think sometimes that's one of the biggest things we're running against is this disillusionment and this disengagement that people feel because they haven't seen the change that they've needed in their lives to this point. And it's frustrating because people deserve so much better. Our government should exist to be creating this foundation that people's lives can start from, for them to jump off of and build a strong life and a dignified life. But we have failed to deliver on that for so long. And I think a really big part of that going back is the way that for essentially a generation, we have allowed corporate power to run out of control. It has taken over our political parties. It has crushed labor power. It has taken over our media. And what has happened is that it's created a very singularly focused government. And a lot of the benefits of the work that our politicians do go to the most wealthy and the most powerful. And everyone else is left to struggle. And what that has caused is exactly what Paul is talking about. People feeling like, what is voting going to do? And I want to say that in some ways, Paul is right. Voting for one person doesn't make the difference. And it takes a lot more work than that. And I wish that it didn't, because I know that people's lives are hard and they are busy and people are forced to work 2 and 3 jobs and their kids are struggling in school and they need to help them out. And people have to do so much work just to keep their heads above water. So when I tell people again that you have to engage with our democracy, you have to engage with our government on an ongoing basis, I know it seems daunting. And I know that's why a lot of people drop out of the process. You know, something like 80% of Democrats don't even vote. And that's something we should be ashamed of, and it should be something that we're working to fix. And it gets back to what I was just talking about, is if you don't give people something to believe in, why should they show up? If you're just saying the other guy's bad and I'll do a few less bad things, but I'm not actually going to do anything to make your life better, I'm just going to try to maintain status quo, and I'm just going to try to prevent the quote-unquote other side from making things worse, that's uninspiring. That doesn't do enough for people. And when people are genuinely struggling to survive, they need to see someone who's saying, I recognize those problems and I'm willing to fight for them. So, yes, just voting in November doesn't solve that problem. Just electing me doesn't solve that problem, but it's the work that we can do from there. And the work that you can do is organizing work, right? You can move even out of just thinking of politics as just electing people and sending them to Washington, D.C. Because politics is so much broader than that when you think about organizing, say, your apartment building or your neighborhood. Because what we need to be doing is building power for regular people in all of the spaces that we exist, in our communities, in our workplaces, in our housing, because then you can call on that power when you need it. And that's much more local, and it's much more focused on the exact problems that you and the people around you are facing. And that's something that we can be doing as well. So that's another activity you can take on top of voting to, again, build that power. Because then what happens when that next city council seat is open, or county council seat's open, whatever, school board seat, federal government seat, you can go to your neighbors that you now have a group with and say, let's talk about this. Let's bring this person in. Let's ask them questions. Let's push them on these issues. Now you have, say, 100 people that when you're not happy about the direction that something's going, or you want to influence the direction something's going, you can wrangle them and get a email petition going, or get a day at Leg Hall where you're going to stand up for the thing that you believe in. So there's more that we can be doing here, and I know it's a lot to ask for people because, again, I know people's lives are busy and they're hard, but we have to find a way to break through and do these things, because we cannot continue to allow just corporate power, just the wealthiest and most powerful people in our country to continue to rule, because we have seen the effects of that, and it has been stagnating wages, unaffordable housing, and people just living in a way that gives them no hope. And we have to really find a way to combat that. And I think building power at a local level and then using it more broadly is one of the best ways to do that. And I think running on platforms and actually fighting for working people, we have to elect more people that are willing to do that. We have to get the influence of money out of politics. These are all the things that will start to break the system that we have. You know, I think a lot of people are like, now to say it too, oh, the system's broken. We have this broken system of power. In some ways, it's more like we have to break this system of power, because it's working well for the people who put it in place. It's just not working well for the vast majority of people. And we have to break it and take back power for ourselves. Oh, this is a great one. So Sherry's asking, what are you going to do to help control the new Postmaster General? It takes an act of Congress to close the post office, but they're going to be closed on Saturdays, so that's starting in August. This is a great topic. I've actually been talking to a few letter carriers about this and kind of working on a post about it, because I think it's incredibly important to talk about. The post office is an essential and public good that should be fully funded without question. It is ridiculous that, one, we have enacted a bill in 2006 that's called the Postal Accountability Enhancement Act. And we need to repeal this act first and foremost. What this act did is that it intentionally destabilized the post office, because there are forces in the government and outside the government that want to privatize postal service. And what this act did is it said that the USPS has to fully fund its like benefits and pension programs for like 50 or 75 years. So basically like funding a retirement account for someone who hasn't even been born yet. And that is obviously very costly. So what it looks like when you look at the post office on a balance sheet is that, look at this thing, it's losing all this money. But that's a lie. The post office is self-sustaining. Again, this is all an effort to privatize it. But that is not what we need. I mean, think about the fact that you can get a letter to a rural place in our country for 50 cents. If you tried to do the same thing with USPS, DHL, FedEx, the cheapest they're going to do it for is $15, first of all. And The USPS has incredible infrastructure. They cover every single door. That looks incredibly valuable to a capitalist, to someone who wants to make money on this. But it is a public good that we have invested in and built and needs to remain a public good. I also want to call out some of the things that letter carriers have been telling me. So the Postmaster General, as Sherry mentions, is basically enacting like process changes and rule changes that are intentionally slowing down the delivery of mail. So if this happens to you, I just want you to think for a minute and pause when you're mad that a letter you were trying to get to someone in 2 days doesn't get there and it needed to, or something that was supposed to come to you didn't get to you in time and you needed it to. Please recognize that this is not on the carrier and it's not on the clerk at the window. The workers of the USPS have been put into terrible conditions now where they are also being asked to do more work in less time. And what the intention is, again, is to break down the service. Because if you start missing deliveries or if mail stops coming on Saturdays, you're going to start getting pissed off at the service. You're going to start saying, why do we even have this? This doesn't even work. And that's exactly what the people who want to privatize the system want to happen. It's happening right now actually in Philadelphia with sanitation workers. You know, sanitation workers are fighting for better conditions, and because of that, the process changes have made it so that pickups aren't happening consistently. People's garbage isn't getting picked up. People are getting mad at the workers, but it's not the workers' fault. It's the management's choice to change process, to restrict schedules, to try to make people do more with less that is causing those issues. So keep that in mind if you start to see problems with the post office, because it is not your mail carrier who has caused this problem. It is the management who has made the choice to create this problem. So, absolutely need to repeal the Postal Accountability Enhancement Act, and again, continue to use the platform of a Senate seat to do this advocacy and this education. Because what we actually need to happen is for everybody who wants to get mad at their letter carrier for that delivery not coming on Saturday, is we need to take that energy and focus it at the actual problem, which, to Sherry's point, is the new Postmaster General that has been put in place by Trump to destroy the post office. All right. So Karen says, I'm a grandmother raising an 8-year-old grandson because his parents are addicted to heroin. They get help and services. I have to fight for help and services for my grandson. Everything goes by income, which it should not. He's not my biological child, so we've had to spend our retirement savings. What can you do to help us grandparents raising these children? Karen, thank you for standing by your family. I'm sorry, I'm sure is incredibly difficult. And I think this is such a great example of how we force vulnerable people and children into situations where they shouldn't have to be. This country is incredibly wealthy, and we can do a much better job of taking care of people. So, on the side of your grandson's parents, I think one thing that we don't do nearly enough of, and we don't fund nearly enough of, is treatment for addiction. So people who are suffering addiction absolutely need to get services to treat that so they can actually be rehabilitated. And that's something that I'm proposing that is included in Medicare for All. Like, addiction services should be included. It is a medical issue that needs to be treated medically. And I think what we were talking about earlier about this expansion of Social Security applies to your family as well. So we can expand payments that come from Social Security and ensure that they are granted to families like yours. Guaranteeing housing as a human right. That's a huge piece as well, because particularly for people who are facing addiction, sometimes just getting that kind of one leg of the stool in place is enough to fight that addiction. But if you are fighting an addiction, struggling to keep a job, and struggling to keep housing, it's really a house of cards, and all of those things kind of fall apart. But if you can get someone stable housing, which we can absolutely do in this country, then you can let them take that one stress out of their life and focus on now getting a job, focus on now dealing with that addiction. And I think the other piece of what you're talking about, Karen, is the fact that things are based on income. And that is a huge problem with the vast majority of services in our country right now. There are way too many people who either fall into the gap and don't make little enough to get services and don't make enough to pay for them. And then there's people like your family where they maybe make too much to get the services, but then have to use all of their savings to try to help their family. And what this has done is created this group of people who can't get any services when they need them, and it creates a situation where people are falling into, say, debt or losing their own stability because they have to use their funds to care for a loved one. And this, I think this applies more broadly even, when we start to talk about elder care as well as loved ones that are living with addiction. So I think when we talk about all of these universal programs, that's what becomes really important, is not having it be means tested, not having it be income based, because a lot of people need services outside of that band of earning that the current programs say deserve it. So Marlon asked, how do you plan to have cannabis removed from the Schedule 1 drug list and to open up an avenue for peer-reviewed research to be conducted and eventually lead to safer cannabis legislation? So I think what we need are politicians who are not bought by the pharmaceutical industry, because the pharmaceutical industry spends a lot of money attempting to keep cannabis from becoming legalized. And the reason for that is because in states where it has been legalized, they have seen their sales of opioids as well as anxiety medications and other pain medications drop. So pharmaceutical companies are spending quite a bit of money trying to keep politicians in seats to protect their profits. The thing is, the political mandate and public will is already there. This is an incredibly popular policy position, legalizing marijuana. Something like 70% of Americans approve legalizing marijuana. That number is the same for the state of Delaware. So we don't need to fight with the public to legalize. We need to get rid of the influence of corporate money that's trying to keep it from becoming legalized. And this is important to me because keeping marijuana legal, it's a carceral issue. It's used to target black and brown, predominantly kids, to lock them up. And we know that black people are like 4 times more likely to be put in jail for marijuana than white people are, even though they use marijuana at the same rates. So there's a inherent issue with keeping marijuana illegal that is a racist issue and a criminal justice issue that we need to repair as well. So the way you do it is by getting people who are in office who recognize that this is the right thing to do and aren't paid to oppose that point of view. So Brianna asks, what are your plans as it relates to education disparity, especially among communities that have been left behind, particularly black and brown communities? This is a really great question. And one of our co-coordinators members actually worked on this issue, and a lot of our supporters have been working and fighting for this. So we in the state of Delaware do not have equitable education funding. And we are one of the few states that doesn't have what's called weighted funding. And what weighted funding does is that it puts additional money toward students who are coming from low income communities, towards students who are English language learners, and towards special needs students. So we know that our schools are inherently unequal already, and then Delaware is not even doing what the vast majority of other states are doing. I think there's maybe like 2 or 3 states who don't do this. So we know our funding is unequal, and then we're not even taking the steps that other states do to fix that problem. And people that have been in power for, a decade plus, like Senator Coons and Carper and Governor Carney, they've effectively resegregated our schools here. And we need to undo that. And we need to actually give students and teachers the resources they need to deliver education. I mean, our schools are being sued in court, and our state is trying to essentially say that they don't need to guarantee an education to every single student. And they're fighting against this funding issue in court right now. And this is a place where I think the federal government absolutely needs to be doing more. In the state of Delaware, only 10% of our school funding comes from the federal government. The federal government should absolutely be investing more in education. When we again look at our budget and we see more than half of our discretionary spending goes toward military spending, and yet, as Brianna points out, we have incredibly unequal schools that are falling apart, schools that can't even buy new books, like history books that are out of date. Like, what are we doing? Where are our priorities? So this is a place where I think more so than some other candidates, I talk a lot about how the federal government needs to do a better job around education. We need to move away from relying predominantly on things like property taxes to fund our schools. Again, something that is inherently unequal and creates inequality in our own school systems and even within districts at times. We need to really think about what we're investing in. I keep reflecting on the fact that at the beginning of the year, we gave Amazon $4.5 million to build a warehouse here, but then we made the Christina School District go to a referendum to raise $10 million. So we're giving billion-dollar corporations $4.5 million, and we're requiring our schools to go to their residents to beg for money to fund basic services. And these are the exact situations that we should not be putting our students in, our teachers in, our schools in, our people in. And I really believe it needs to start from the top down, and we need to change how we think about education. I was talking about it with the Postal Service. Education is a public good. When we invest in education, the returns are vast. It's good for us. If you want to make an economic argument, there's a good economic argument. If you want to make a moral argument, there's a good moral argument to wanting all of our populace to be well educated. And yet, it's not a priority. And that is something that has to change. So, fully funded, equitable education from childcare and universal pre-K all the way through trade schools and colleges are like the number 2 thing that I talk about in my platform, because it's incredibly relevant in a state like Delaware where the schools are failing so many of our students, particularly in minority and low income communities. All right, I've got a minute left. I don't know if there are any quick ones. So Troy asks a good question, and this is not, again, it's like, I really love to make this point to people, that the problems that people bring up are problems that I have heard multiple times. These are not things that individuals are experiencing. These are things that are systemic and that affect tons of people. So I say that to just reiterate that anything that people are going through, it's not that individual's fault. We have created bad systems that need to be completely broken down and rebuilt. And I'm going to get to Troy's question, but I just want to make that point first, that like so many of these things I have heard multiple times. And I just want people to recognize that if you are suffering from some of these things, it is not your fault. This is not an individual issue. This is the fault of our leaders having let us down for generations. But to Troy's question, which is, there's an issue with Medicaid dropping or making individuals ineligible if they receive any income more than $1,350. This causes the individual to have to move to the marketplace and receive a tax credit but still pay a premium. And the problem is that the individual is then taxed at the end of the year for the credit they received. How do you plan to tackle this issue? And this gets at exactly what I was talking about earlier with these programs that are terribly means tested, that are given to too few people. And what happens in a year where maybe you make a little more money, you can get dropped from it. Maybe your Social Security payments increase, which should be a good thing, but then it causes you to lose your Medicaid. So Medicaid is a state-administered program, but that's not to say that we can't fix this problem at a federal level, because this is why we need Medicare for all. There won't be these gaps. There won't be these places where people can just fall in the cracks when we have a universal single-payer system that covers every single person. And I've had family members who have made choices about their lives to avoid this exact problem that Troy is talking about. That they said no to a promotion at work because they did the math and they said, okay, my wages will go up by a few dollars an hour, but that means that I'll lose Medicaid. And but I won't make enough money to pay for insurance, and I won't get it offered for my job because I'll still be part-time. And these are the equations that we're making people do, and the decisions that we're forcing on people. Forgo more money because it means that your children might go without health care. And it's completely unnecessary. There is a system that has been used in dozens of other countries and proven to work, can absolutely work here, will save us $450 billion a year that we spend on healthcare unnecessarily right now, and prevent the exact same, the double jeopardy essentially that Troy is talking about, where we punish people for doing slightly better by then forcing them into an incredibly expensive Affordable Care Act marketplace plan that, yes, maybe they get a tax credit for, so the monthly premium isn't so bad, but a lot of those plans come with $5,000 or $8,000 deductibles. So you go from having Medicaid, which is relatively comprehensive coverage, to then needing to spend monthly premium on, and then $5,000 to $8,000 before you actually get health care coverage. People who are making a little more than minimum wage, even if they do get that raise that, bumps them off of Medicaid, they can't afford that. So we're pushing people out of a decent program off a precipice where they can't even get any health insurance, and now they're living their lives in fear of becoming sick or getting into an accident. This is why we need universal programs. Single payer, Medicare for all, covers everyone, covers everything, so we don't have these problems and don't force people into these situations. So 8:33, that is my time. I really appreciate it. I know there's a couple questions that we didn't get to. There's actually quite a few. So I apologize. I will try to get to them in comments. We always try to clean up the things that we leave behind, because I know that people have been asking fantastic questions, and I really appreciate that everyone, new faces show up, recurring faces show up every week, and I really enjoy these conversations that we get to have. Ideally, in another campaign life, and another timeline, these are the types of things we'd be doing in person. But I'm really grateful that people give the time, and that we have this space on Monday evenings to talk about these things, because they are important and they're why I'm in this race. So thank you for all your questions. One little update I have is we're doing something kind of fun this weekend. The team has been working tirelessly on putting together a 24-hour live stream fundraiser. So kicking off on Saturday at 11 a.m. all the way until Sunday at 11 a.m. We're going to be doing a bunch of different kind of segments. So there'll be Q&As with myself and some other Delaware candidates coming on. We have a bunch of musicians lined up, comedians, artists, and a variety of special guests. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm hoping that I don't end up with like a 4 a.m. time slot. We'll see. Maybe I'll take that one from bed if I do. But you can tune into that over on my Twitch channel. as that's where everybody will be. It's twitch.tv/Jessica_Scarane if you're looking for me over there. So that'll be a whole lot of fun, and hopefully we'll raise some dollars. And we're just under two months from September 15th primary. We are in crunch time. Every day counts for the fundraising that we're doing and our voter outreach. So if you are able to donate, I really appreciate it. You can do that at justfordelaware.com/donate. If you can ask your friends to donate, ask them to match you. Say, I'm throwing this candidate $27 or $10. Can you do it too? How about you? And get a little match train going. That really helps. Someone asked about corporate dollars during this live stream, and I said, I'm not taking any. And that makes it harder, right? But it also means that we've had literally thousands of people donate to this campaign their hard-earned money, and that means more to me than any corporate PAC money. So if you can find friends that donate, I really appreciate that too. And if you're able to give time, that is incredibly valuable as well. We are phone banking every day, reaching voters. So if you're able to sign up to volunteer, we'd love to have you on the team. And you could do that at justfordelaware.com/volunteer. So that's it. I really appreciate your time. Hopefully I'll see you next Monday. We'll have an event up. Make sure you invite your friends, share it around. And thank you so much, and everybody take care. All right, bye.